So the other day, I went to my closet to grab a hoodie. It's getting to be that time of year where the official uniform is shorts and a hoodie. And as I was pulling out the hoodie, I caught a glimpse of my high school letter jacket. Y'all remember those? Maybe you had one of those. Yes, I still have mine. No, I didn't try it on to see if it still fit. However, I did get a glimpse of the left chest of my letter jacket, and I saw all of the sports that I lettered in high school. And honestly, if you were to look at that, you would probably think, that's pretty impressive. 3 years lettered in football, 3 years lettered in basketball, and 4 years lettered in track. And that sounds impressive, but there's a little bit behind this. You see, I graduated in a class of 15 people. So if you go out for a sport, you make the team. Okay, so that is a reality. Also, I look at those 3 years in football and 3 years in basketball and 4 years in track. I can honestly say that I earned track. I earned track in such a way that I was decently good at it. Football and basketball, maybe basketball for a couple of years, but let's call football for what it really is. It was the participation trophy. I was not good at football. In fact, part of the problem was my stature. Part of the problem is the fact that at best I was like 150 and 5'10", but most of the time I was 5'10" and about 135 pounds. That doesn't lend itself to be a good football player. The other part of the problem, though, was my mind. Part of the problem is just the fact that in my mind, football did not work well for me. And one of the reasons why football did not work well for me is I played end, and we played 8-man football, so we didn't have enough to field an 11-man team most of the time. But as an end, my job predominantly was to block. And to block was pretty easy as long as there was a guy right in front of me, and that was the guy that I was supposed to block. But if there was a guy that maybe wasn't right in front of me, and there was different defensive schemes, and there were pulling guards, and there were all of these things going, and there were too many moving parts for my mind. And so I just really wasn't good at it. That's probably why track was kind of my thing, because it was point A, point B, run fast. But when there was too many parts, it just kind of became confusing for me. So I tell you that to let you know a little bit about our passage here today. There's a lot of moving parts. In fact, as you kind of look at our passage, it kind of seems like there's this thing going on, and this thing going on, and this thing going on. There's actually either 4 different groups or 4 different individuals that are all kind of doing their own thing. And like kind of like that football play where there was a lot of moving parts and it was all working toward a whole, I do think there's a bigger picture. And so as we look at this bigger picture, I think it's highly important that we kind of dive into the moving parts, but as we dive into the moving parts, let's understand that there's still a big picture at play. We're going to dive into Mark chapter 14. So if you want to turn there on your phone or your Bible, but if you'd like to use one of the pew Bibles that are in the seats in front of you, that's page 850. Now with that, one of the things that we have to understand, and we get to Mark chapter 14, everything now is about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. It's just kind of, we've taken that turn that is the focal point of the rest of the book. Now, let's go ahead and read verses 1 and 2. It says, "It was 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking to arrest him by stealth and kill him. For they said, 'Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people. Now, I would look at verse 2 and say verse 2 is a vital verse for us to understand here. Now, how many of you grew up in a church tradition that said, that kind of did the stages of the cross and the various things of Jesus last week? And oftentimes what we encounter is Wednesday, and Wednesday is often called Silent Wednesday. And they say there was nothing going on that day. Well, we do have a little bit going on that day. That's where this scheming of the scribes and the priest is taking place. But also they had full intention not to deal with Jesus until after the Passover. And I think that's important that we understand. Now, depending on who you read and look at, the population of Jerusalem would have been anywhere from probably 25,000 to maybe 60,000 people during the day of Jesus, which doesn't seem like large to us, but that would have been a good-sized city in the ancient world. And since Jerusalem is the only place that you could celebrate Passover, they said that it would swell to 2 or 3 times the size of what it normally was. One historian by the name of Josephus actually put that number in the millions. So you might guess that this is not a time to cause a riot, that the Romans aren't going to take it kindly with the Jewish people causing this kind of riot coming up. But I have to ask the question, why? I have to ask the question, why are the scribes and the Pharisees and the priests so bothered by Jesus? I think one of the things, and we kind of look at the larger picture of the book of Mark, one of the things that is beginning to happen is Jesus is growing in popularity. And as Jesus is growing in popularity, that is a threat to their comfort and their control. And so ultimately, what's happening here, the religious leaders love their comfort, control, status, and power more than anything. Jesus could not be an option to them because ultimately that meant that they would have to give up a lot of what they held so dear in their lives. Now, let's just be honest, none of us are scheming to kill Jesus right now. But I want to talk about specifically comfort and control. When I look at the last 18 months, of everything that we've gone through, world, nation, different things like that, I'm going to suggest this. I'm going to suggest that many of us are addicted to comfort. We love our comfort. And the fear that comes up is that I'm not going to be comfortable. All of us love to throw off our shoes and kick up the recliner and just live in our comfortable little bubble. Anybody there? I actually had a person come to me say one time, I'm addicted to comfort. I don't want to be uncomfortable. And also control. I think the greatest fear that people have is losing control. And so when stuff is going on that we don't quite understand, and it's really a threat to our lives, we begin to react with fear. So I want you to hold on to this, because we're actually going to come back to these guys here in just a few moments. But we're going to go ahead and read on. Let's look at verse 3. And while he was at Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, perhaps Simon was somebody that Jesus had healed, as he was reclining at table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, why was the ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And they scolded her. But Jesus said, leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me, for you will always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. So we really don't know who this woman is, other than Matthew and John suggest that this is Mary, the sister of Lazarus and Martha. And that might explain the extravagant love on her part, but we're just going to call her for today the woman, because that's what we understand that Mark calls her. Now, understand that she comes in with a bottle of a perfume, a bottle of oil, and this is most likely from the spice trade from India. And most likely has exotic oils, exotic spices, and different things like that. And we're told that it's worth over 300 denarii. Now, we look at that and say, that really means nothing to us other than it's expensive. But we really don't know how expensive this is. So to put this in perspective, if you are a common laborer during the day and age of Jesus, like you went out and you worked one day, you would get 1 denarius. And so given feasts and holidays and Sabbath days, this is over a year's worth of salary for a normal person. And so she brings in a family heirloom maybe. She brings in maybe the dowry that she would have been given if she would have married. That she comes in with the emergency savings. And she breaks it open and pours it over Jesus' head. Now, I look at this and I begin to say, the adverbs that we would need to use to describe the actions, to me, seem too simple. To say that this is extravagant, to say that this is reckless or generous or abundant or selfless, it just rings hollow when you see the absolute sacrifice that this woman does. And I have to look at this, and again, comparison with those who we just talked about, who loved everything before Jesus. They loved their comfort, they loved their control, they loved everything, and that's what they held dear to. This woman here, this woman loved nothing more than Jesus. When you give that kind of gift, when you are that extravagant, when you are that reckless in expressing your love, we say, she loves nothing more than Jesus. It was all about her loyalty to him, her glorifying him and honoring him, and just showing that her love is big and her love is large, and she wanted everyone to know it. But as she did this, there were those there that day that condemned her. They were the practical thinkers. They were the logical people. And instead of condemning her, Jesus commends her and even digs in and says, listen, you don't get what she just did. Jesus says, she's prepared me for burial. The reality is, Jesus, as he gets closer to the cross, continues to talk more and more about his death. And his death is very imminent. And he says, listen, what she has done is preparing me for what's going to happen in just a matter of days. And I think about this. We really don't get burial customs. We have our own here today. But when you go back 2,000 years ago in Israel, they had specific burial customs. And one of them was you would, as a family, go seek a plot where you could carve out a cave in the side of a hill. And as you're carving out the cave, you understand, this becomes the family plot. And so when a person would die, they would lather them with nard. Lather them with this expensive oil that smells really good. And the reason why they would do that is because we know that decaying bodies they stink really, really bad. And so this was a way to cover up that odor. And eventually the body would decay. And after the body would decay and only bones were left, they would take the bones and place them in a box and leave them in the family cave. And what she's basically doing, according to Jesus, is he's saying, she's preparing me for that. And so, listen, This is a big thing. This is an extravagant thing. She didn't realize what she was doing. Jesus also places greatness on her in such a way that he says, listen, this act of love, this act of reckless, extravagant, I can't even explain love. Wherever the gospel is preached, she gets to be part of the story. She gets to be part of the story. And think about this. We're 2,000 years after Jesus in a remote corner of New Mexico. And what are we doing? We're talking about her. The promise of Jesus rings true. So remember, she loves nothing more than Jesus. We look at the scribes and the priests. They loved everything about their life, and that was what it was all about. But there's also another group, and it says them or they, and we're going to include this as the apostles. These are the followers of Jesus who were with him in this house at this point in time. And if you go back to verse 4, it says, there were some who said to themselves indignantly, why was the ointment wasted like that? Why was the ointment wasted? So I actually went back. I have a couple of books in my office that give me kind of the original meaning, the original word meaning of things. So I looked at indignant. Indignant, I've always heard, is kind of like one of the strongest forms of anger. So I looked at it, and the literal term for indignant is to snort. Now I want you to think about that. It's an anger that is so vehement, so strong, so whatever, you almost do not have words to express how angry, but you're snorting mad. And they were snorting mad. And they were snorting bad because this was such a waste. They could have used this to help the poor. And instead of Jesus saying, you know what, you're right, they could have used this to help the poor, Jesus says, you're always going to have the poor with you. You're always going to have the poor with you, and you're always going to have the opportunity to give an offering to the poor. In fact, Jesus is referring to the law. In Deuteronomy chapter 15, it says, there will never cease to be poor in the land. Therefore, I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy, and to the poor in your land. Jesus is affirming this. But I think one thing that we have to grab a hold of here today, giving to the poor is a good thing. Anybody, would you agree with that? Helping those who are needy, helping a brother in need, all of these things are good things. But Jesus says that there's something better. And listen, if we're not careful, we're going to exchange the best thing for good things. The good thing is helping the poor. The good thing is doing works of righteousness. Sometimes they make us sleep better at night. But there is nothing more important than loving Jesus. There's nothing more important than loving Jesus with everything that we got. And I want to let you know that the disciples were not just jerks. They were coming at this from a religious place. This was Passover. And there's a couple of things that kind of play out during Passover. We know about the Passover Seder, do we not? Passover Seder is where they have the meal, and each part of the meal represents the past, and they retell the story. There's also the sacrifice of the Passover lamb. This is a big thing. We're actually going to talk Passover next week. We're going to talk communion and what all that kind of comes into play. But there was another very important part of Passover for Jewish people. There was something demanded of them. You know what it was? A gift to the poor. And so these guys are going, oh, do you know what we could do with a year's salary? Do you know how much good we could do? And here's the challenge, though. The disciples are more concerned with religious obligation and image than they are in loving Jesus. And honestly, this is gut check for me. This is gut check for me because, listen, I think it's real easy to do things out of obligation and making sure everybody says, hey, that's a good Christian right there. I mean, how often do we come to church on Sunday morning because this is what we're supposed to do? How often do we give out of a sense of obligation? How often do we serve? How often do we pray? How often do we read the Bible just because we feel like it's the thing that we're supposed to do? Rather than having all of this be something that it's an expression of our love for Jesus. So again, there's a contrast. It's not just the woman, and there's a contrast between her and the religious leaders. There's a contrast between her and the disciples, but there's one. There's one of the disciples that clearly became even more snorting mad than the others. And his name is Judas. Let's look at verses 11 and 12, or 10 and 11. Then Judas Iscariot, one who was one of the 12, went to the chief priest in order to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. And he sought an opportunity to betray him. What do we do with Judas? In your lifetime, have you ever met a person with the name of Judas? And there's a lot of Bible names. In my family, that's what we do. We use Bible names. But as we were considering names for one of our 3 boys, and you're welcome, we did not choose Judas. Wasn't even in the realm of thinking of, we want to give that to our kid because we want that to follow them around for the rest of their lives. Every time you think of Judas, you think of somebody who betrays and is a traitor and is just a vile human being. And there's definitely a contrast. And just like we can't find enough adverbs to describe the actions of this woman, I can't find enough adverbs to describe the horrific actions of Judas. I mean, he's the guy that betrayed Jesus. If there's a person on the face of the planet that you don't want to be known for betraying, it is Jesus, and Judas got that. So what is it? What is it in Judas that was there? I mean, was he resentful? Was he jealous? Was it greed? And actually, we're told that he kind of skimmed off the top. He was the money guy of the 12. But I think there's something else. They call him Judas Iscariot. Now, that's a big thing for us to understand. What does Iscariot mean? Well, that's actually part of a group of people that were ultra-nationalists that really had this high hopes of the Messiah, and the high hopes of the Messiah meant the Messiah was going to come, and he was going to have an insurrection, and they were going to kick the Romans out, and they got back their kingdom that they wanted. And it was becoming abundantly clear that while Jesus might be the Messiah, he was not the Messiah that Judas wanted, because Judas had this certain set of expectations of Jesus. Now listen, we're never going to be at a spot, I hope we're never going to be at a spot where we are so angry at Jesus that we are willing to betray him to the enemies. But this is what I do know. I do know, because I get to talk to people all the time who are disillusioned with Jesus. They're disillusioned with God. You want to know why? Because they've built a certain set of expectations. And when Jesus doesn't live up to what their expectations were, it wrecks their faith. I can't tell you the number of times where somebody said, well, I started giving, but Jesus didn't. I started going to church, but Jesus didn't pull through. I started praying with my wife. I started reading my Bible every day. I started trying to be a better person, but Jesus didn't. And that set of expectations that people build end up just getting to a place of complete disillusion. And I don't know if that's what happened with Judas, but I do know this. Judas had a front row seat at the first church of Jesus for 3 years. Think about that. He saw the miracles, saw the walking on water, feeding of the 5,000. He saw the demons leave, thousands of demons leave an individual. He got to see all of this, but it wasn't enough. The knowledge that he had never really kind of translated into transformation. I'm just going to say it like this. Ultimately, his knowledge of Jesus never really turned into knowing Jesus. And Jesus says that the definition of eternal life is to know God. And he also went on to say, if you know me, you know my Father. And so for whatever reason, Judas, for whatever reason, who should have loved Jesus even more than this woman loved Jesus, he did evil by betraying a friend. May that never be said of us. So with that, I mentioned that there might be a bigger picture at play. So let me just kind of recap a couple of things. As we talk about all the moving parts, the religious leaders wanted to kill Jesus, but after Passover. I think that's important for us to understand. But after Passover, Jesus is having supper. In fact, next week we're going to talk about Jesus having supper. A woman barges in and anoints him. Disciples are snorting mad over this. And Jesus says, don't be mad. She's done an incredible thing. She's done a good thing. She's prepared me for burial. And then after that, I mean, like, one of the disciples is even more snorting mad, and he goes out and looks for a way to betray Jesus so that he'll be handed over to the people that want to kill him. Now, not to give the story away, but you probably do know the story. Jesus didn't die after Passover. He died on Passover because God needed a Passover lamb to take away the sin of the world. And I think about everybody is making their own choices, doing their own thing here, but here's the big picture. God is writing this story. God is the ultimate one who is the architect of everything that is going on. And what is amazing to me is that with all of the moving pieces and people trying to control their aspect of the story, God is writing the story that needs to be written and that he wants to write. God was piecing together this story as many were just going about life the way they thought they were supposed to go throughout life. But one thing I think we have to understand is that as God is writing this story, people are making their choices. This woman, she chose to express her love to Jesus in an extravagant way, yet in doing so, God is writing this story. There were evil men who were plotting to kill Jesus, and they had a plan in place. They had a timeline in place. But God is writing the story. There are disciples who are mad because in their mind, she's dishonored Passover. And one of them gets so mad that he leaves and he goes and he seeks out the people who are wanting to kill Jesus and says, listen, I can make this happen. And ultimately, we have to say that God is writing the story. And folks, for me, this is comforting. It's comforting to know that as people are making their individual choices, and I think we have to look at those who are making individual choices and say, where do I fit in here? Where's a tension point that I need to look inside in my life? But here's the beautiful thing. There's a lot that we don't get or understand today. I'll even go as far as to say there's a lot going on that I don't know that we're supposed to understand. And we're still in the middle of a pandemic. We got that. You know, a couple weeks ago we talked about the end times, and you know, I said, listen, even just in our own world of last week, there was an earthquake, and there's wars and rumors of wars, and there's drought, and there's famine, and there's disease. And we're just going to go ahead and add the hurricane this week. I don't have to know everything. I don't have to know everything that's going on, but I can certainly say this. God is still writing his story. He is still writing the story. And listen, you may be walking through something right now. And I want to give you some assurance to know whatever it is that you're walking through right now, God's still writing his story. And I can say that he's not done writing his story, but even down to the personal level, whatever it is you're walking through, God's not done. He's not done with you. He's not done with your story. And so as you think about that, I want to give you 3 prayers. As you pray this week, as you dive in, have that time where you study God's Word and you pray, I want to give you 3 prayers to pray. One is this: God, help me to love nothing more than Jesus. We love a lot of things. Help us to not love anything more than him. Also, God, help me to trust you as you write your story, even when I don't understand. And that might even be, I don't understand what's going on in my marriage. I don't understand what's going on in my finances. I don't understand what's going on in my job. I don't understand what's going on globally. God, help me trust you as you write this story. And finally this: God, help me to be a willing participant in your story. All the moving parts of this story, there's only one that's commended. The others really become cautionary tales of don't do that. Don't be like that. So let us all kind of lean in to Jesus and say, Jesus, I don't want to be that. Help me to be that. Will you join me in prayer? Father in heaven, continue to write your story. Continue to be the architect of history. And as you do, may our story be, we love nothing more than Jesus. Thank you in his name. Amen.